Hello and welcome back to this channel. My name is Frida Weisel, and here I explore topics related to Judaism. This year, during the Jewish high holidays, there was an attack on the Manchester Jewish community while the community was observing the holiday. 2 people were killed and the community deeply hurting. This has led to quite a bit of dialogue about the situation of antisemitism in the UK, and I wanted to hear more about it. So I invited on Izzy Posen, whom you may have met on my channel before, to share his views on the situation, as well as hopefully share a bit of a catch-up on his life. Last we spoke, Izzy's Hasidic mother had suddenly passed away in a car accident, and he wanted me to dedicate that video in her memory. Izzy grew up in the UK Hasidic community, and although he no longer is Hasidic, he continues to work in Yiddish, Hasidic commentary, and he has a vibrant Twitter account where he shares his thoughts. Welcome, Izzy, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Frida. And as we say, good moyed.
Good moyed. Yes, it's Yantiv now. It's the holiday now. The intermediate days. It's been a while. When did we last speak? More than a year ago, right?
It must have been. I think it was around the time of my mother's first Yutzat, which just passed. So yes, it must have been a year ago, yeah.
Well, let's start off by talking about what happened this Yantiv in Manchester. For the viewers who are not familiar, if you can summarize what happened.
Absolutely. And I just want to preface by saying I am a British Jew, but I'm obviously not a spokesperson for British Jews. And we'll get into some analysis, and I'm sure lots of British Jews will disagree with me or have different experiences. I'm just sharing my own personal experiences. So yeah, we were in shul on Yom Kippur, as most British Jews are, and I should say the British Jewish community is quite mixed, and a lot of it is quite secular. But on Yom Kippur, I think most Jews, or certainly more Jews than usual, come to shul, so the shuls were packed. We were in shul, and around between Musaf and Mincha, so around afternoon time, there was a break, and rumors started trickling in that something had happened. None of us had our phones there, none of us are connected and reading the news on that day. Rumors started trickling in that something has happened, and also we started seeing a heightened police presence. Police were coming around to all the synagogues in the area. I live in a very Jewish neighborhood. There's lots of synagogues here.
You're in Stamford Hill?
No, Golders Green, Hendon.
Got
It's a more modern community. It's quite mixed. There's some Haredi communities here, but there's also non-Haredi, modern Orthodox, Reformed. There's all kinds. It's quite a mixed Jewish neighborhood, but it's very Jewish. It was only at nightfall we came home to break fast. And we switched on our phones and we started seeing the horrific news. And this had happened 9:30 in the morning. So it was already almost, it was 10 hours later. So there was a lot of news, and the Prime Minister had made a statement, and there was a lot to catch up on. A lot has happened in that time that the Jewish community was just starting to catch up on. And usually breaking fast, I don't have to tell your listeners, is a kind of joyous time. It's a Yom Tov, we celebrate, you feel clean from your sins. You're eating for the first time in 26 hours. And obviously this was a very different mood. We split on our phones. We first tried to catch up on the news, but as we were catching up on the news, now I'll go to the story in a moment. We were seeing messages from our non-Jewish neighbors, for example, who were sending messages of solidarity, which was very nice. So what basically had happened at 9:30 in the morning in Manchester, a Muslim immigrant named Jihad al-Shami, which means jihadist from Syria, and he was an immigrant from Syria, had rammed the car at a synagogue entrance, trying to get in, because I don't know how it's in America, but here all synagogues have quite heavy security in front of them for obvious reasons. He stabbed one of the security guards and got into the premises. But the fact that there was security that he had to bypass gave the worshippers enough time to barricade themselves in the synagogue. And I should say, because it was 9:30 in the morning and they had just started the prayers, there weren't too many people in the synagogue, thankfully, because it could have been much worse if there were kids playing in the front yard, if there were people coming and going. He tried to get into the premises. They barricaded themselves very heroically, not letting him in until the police came. The terrorist was also wearing a fake bomb vest. So the police, threatening to blow himself up. It turned out that it was fake, but they didn't know that. The police shot him to neutralize him, and sadly, one of the police bullets killed one of the mispalalim, one of the worshippers. So there was 2 dead, one by the hands of the terrorists, one by the hands of the police, and a few injured who are still in hospital. A few things to point out about this. Firstly, the unprecedented nature of this in the UK. I know in America you've had several tragic events throughout the years related to this kind of anti-Semitism. In the UK, this was a grim milestone because this is the first time in modern times, going back centuries, that a Jew is killed for being a Jew on UK soil. So this is really emblematic of an anti-Semitism that has crossed a new threshold. So that's something that many Jews reflected on. And another thing that personally that I haven't seen discussed enough, and I'm sure as the dust settles, it will be discussed more, is the failure of the police. To me, in terrorist situations, hostage situations, it makes sense that sometimes they'll be collateral, but this is a 1-to-1 ratio of what the terrorist killed and what the police killed. And it was a lone terrorist. It seems very negligent to me, to my unexpert eyes. It seems very negligent that the police with arms who are trained to deal with situations like this killed somebody. And I'm sure so far there hasn't been much discussion about it in the media. Focus is so far on anti-Semitism and the terrorists. But I'm sure once the dust settles this, it might turn out to be a bit of a scandal. I hope this is properly dealt with, because to me it seems quite scandalous.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I believe the police responded in 8 minutes, right? And as you point out, it might be something the police are not accustomed to. I'm not making any defense to anyone. I'm just thinking if this was particularly surprising that the police ended up killing a worshiper in the process.
Look, I'm sure there'll be a proper investigation. I'm sure the investigation will uncover more details. I'm just pointing out, to me personally, this seems a bit, I don't know. I wouldn't expect that to happen with a lone terrorist. It's not as if it's a huge situation. It's a lone terrorist just with a knife. I don't know. And it's a matter of misaiming and having a bullet go through the synagogue door. Surely people who handle weapons would be better trained on how to handle weapons. The people shot by the police were behind the door. They weren't in the same space as the terrorists. So it's clearly misaiming. So I don't know. I don't want to prejudge. I hope there'll be further discussion about this.
Got it. What else were you going to talk about?
I was going to say another big difference between the American and British context is the lack of gun culture here. So in America, when these things happen, often it's associated with mass shootings, which is much more deadly. Here, it was a guy whose only weapons were his car and a knife, and which means that he was much less deadly, which is why his victims were so few. It could have been much, much worse if he had guns.
It's interesting to compare the UK situation to the US situation. There are some really pronounced cultural differences. And now that we have so much dialogue around anti-Semitism, I'm really interested to understand what the presentation of the situation of Jews in the UK is in particular, as the only real experience I have, obviously, is with how it goes in the US.
Another thing to understand about the difference is we don't have a big history of anti-Semitism in this country in modern times. Obviously, Jews were chased out of here in medieval times. But once they came back in modern times, Jews here always felt like this was a golden era for Jews. We never had a history of anti-Semitism. There were no significant anti-Semitic parties or groups. Unlike in America, where I know there was the KKK and there were other groups, and there was always anti-Semitism on the right. Jews excluded from universities, from clubs. I don't think we have that history in Britain. And related to that is that anti-Semitism nowadays in Britain, as it manifests, seems to be almost exclusively a matter of the left. The left is inaccurate. The Islamo-left alliance. Maybe we can get more into what I mean by that. But there isn't, even the far right here. I know in America, and I see it on X, on Twitter, in America, the far right tends to be quite anti-Semitic. Here, the far right is not anti-Semitic. And it's actually...
What do you mean by that? How is the far right anti-Semitic here and not there?
I think in America, the far right is quite obsessed with Jews. They don't like Jews. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I get that feeling. The marches in Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. That kind of space is quite anti-Semitic. The Candace Owens, the Kanye West, I don't know if you'd count that as right, but there's a space of right-wing anti-Semitism, which is pretty much absent in the UK.
I hear what you're saying. I don't know that I personally experience it, but I hear what you're saying. Go on.
Well, to demonstrate this, so in fact, some people see the far right in the UK as exploiting anti-Semitism for their purposes. I'm not sure I agree with that framing, but for example, there's a very prominent far right agitator in the UK called Tommy Robinson. He organizes anti-Muslim marches. He's been convicted. He's a criminal. He's been in prison several times. He is an agitator. Many see him as a thug. And he, in his public statements, is quite pro-Jewish, pro-Israel. And the diaspora minister of Israel, so the minister in Israel who is responsible for diaspora relationships with diaspora Jews, invited Tommy Robinson to come to Israel as kind of a UK representative because of his love of Israel and Jews. And the Jewish community in the UK is very angered by that. The Jewish community here tends to be fairly liberal, center-left on kind of matters. They don't want to be seen as Islamophobic or supporting the far right. And the Board of Deputies of British Jews, so this is the representative body of British Jews, and many other representative Jewish bodies have released a scathing statement. I've never seen such an angry statement from them, denouncing this invitation and saying that what kind of diaspora minister is this if he didn't bother to consult the British Jewish community before extending this invitation. I think it just demonstrates how the far right in this country is actually seen or wants to be seen as very pro-Israel, to the point where the Jewish community needs to distance itself and say, these are not our allies.
I see. Got it. I understand what you're saying. There's sometimes it's like a right wing or Christian pro-Israel, very strong, almost like taking over the Israel issue for their purposes.
I'm not necessarily sure that would be my analysis of Tommy Robinson and his motives. He may be very sincere. He may genuinely love Jews. And as I said, we don't have a strong history of anti-Semitism in this country on the right. So, there's a lot of love for Jews in this country as well. So he may well be sincere, but I think the Jewish community doesn't want him to be seen as an ally or representative when he is, he has a criminal past and he is seen as stoking up division.
Got it. So you want to also talk about, you touched on where the anti-Semitism is manifesting mostly in the UK, which is on the left. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So this is happening in a context of rising tensions in the country as a whole. The last few years have seen the immigration debate rise to the forefront. We've had record numbers of immigration in recent years, which has consistently been against the democratic wishes of the British people. When people are polled about their views on immigration, people want much lower immigration, and it keeps rising. So, and this has spilled over in quite a bit of anger. Last summer, we had riots that was sparked by somebody with an immigrant background murdering 3 girls, and it sparked
On
riots.
New Year?
No, not on New Year. It was in the summer, I think.
Got it. Okay.
In Southport, and it sparked riots. There were people. There's a strong feeling that not only has there been so much mass immigration, which has brought danger to this country, but also that the government is trying to censor the information known about it. The government, in that case, there was accusations that the government didn't want to release the fact that this person had an immigrant background. And there's been quite a few high-profile cases recently in the last few years where people with an immigrant background have committed violent crimes or sexual abuse. There's been a long, ongoing gang rape scandal in this country where men, mostly from a Pakistani origin, have been sexually abusing and raping British girls, thousands of them. We're talking very, very large numbers for many, many years. And it was kind of not taken seriously because of race relations worries that it might cause tensions. And I think it's all bubbled up. So there's a lot of tension now in the air in this country related to mass immigration, lack of integration, parallel societies, Muslim extremism. And so this isn't unrelated to it, because there is an issue of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. There is an issue of Muslim extremism. And I'm not going to say that Muslims and immigrants are the only ones who pose a danger and are the only ones who exhibit anti-Semitism, but there is clearly a disproportionate amount of anti-Semitism in these immigrant communities, mostly Muslims from Middle Eastern, North African countries. So it's tied into the wider debate.
Interesting. Where does Israel and the war in Israel come in to the picture here? Because I would say in the US, most of what we see as targeted hatred towards Jews, which is how I would describe, for instance, my brother told me he was walking the street and he was yelled at for being a Jew. I would say most of it is born out of the attention brought on Jews by the war in Israel. So where does that come into the picture there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. This is an integral part. We see anti-Semitism rising when there's a flare-up in the Middle East. But these two things aren't mutually exclusive. It's the events of the Middle East, but it's also large numbers of people with allegiances to the Middle East. People from Muslim or Arabic backgrounds who are bringing a lot of this anger. I'm not talking about protesting Israeli policy or protesting Israeli actions. I'm talking about when it goes over to be much more sinister, when it goes over to anti-Semitism, to violence, to hate, which is much more than just protesting Israel.
As a tour guide, I don't meet a lot of people from the UK, but I meet a lot of people from Germany, and they seem to have a lot of the same conversation about Syrian immigrants and how that is changing their population and feelings about that. And if the Syrian immigrants are to blame for anti-Semitism, for instance, in Germany at this point. I want to hear what your thoughts are about how immigration, like what is your own view, how immigration is impacting anti-Semitism and what you feel the government should be doing?
Yeah, I feel very strongly that mass immigration has impacted anti-Semitism and has made Jews less safe across Europe. You're right, it's not isolated to the UK. It's a similar pattern in Germany, similar pattern in France, similar pattern in the Netherlands, in Sweden. Every country which has a significant population of immigrants from a Muslim or a North African, Middle Eastern background is facing these same issues and tensions, and it's undeniable. I think for reasons of community cohesion, the organized Jewish community has kind of avoided putting it in those terms, and perhaps politically they're right to do so. I don't know, but I think when you speak with individual Jews, this is a sentiment that you hear very often, and it's our lived experience. I know amongst which people I feel safe and amongst which I don't, and I know why. It's where I can expect abuse and violence to come from.
What do you think is motivating the governments to bring in so many immigrants? Is it economic incentives?
The immigration policy across Europe, and especially the UK, of the last decade or so has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. And it is widely recognized now across Europe. It's becoming consensus across the right and the left that has been the case. I think there was, firstly, very short-term economic gains. So in the short term, there might be a benefit to low-skilled immigration, but not in the long term. I think there was a lot of short-termism. I think there was also a very naive way of thinking that if only we give people a better life and help them integrate, then all their past prejudices and their past ways, they'll leave that behind. So they might be coming from very extremist countries, but only if we give them a better life and better education and better opportunities, then all become like us. And that was a very naive and dangerous experiment, and it turns out it's absolutely not the case. And I think there's now, as I said, wide recognition that it's been a disaster. And I'm not just talking for Jews, I'm talking for the country as a whole, for the country's finances. A lot of these people come here and become very disproportionately dependent on our welfare state. So this is another difference between Europe and America. In America, you don't have the kind of systematic welfare state, comprehensive welfare state that we have. So in Europe, if you come here and you do work and you become, and you're not doing so well, the state finances you, which means the taxpayer finances, which means the tax keeps going up and up and up. Services keep getting worse and worse and worse. Public services, like many of our services are public, like health services, public here, and this has knock-on effects. I don't want to go into the details and the boring economic details, but obviously when taxes rise, rich people leave and take their wealth with them, so you have to raise taxes even more, and it's just spiral downwards. So that's the economic element, and then there's also the law in all the elements. Again, Europe has a long tradition of, especially Britain, of respect for the law, fairness. Britain is known for kind of the proverbial queue, where we love to queue for hours and hours, and no one will skip the line. And it's kind of these unspoken rules, and people come from very different cultures in large numbers. Don't always abide by these systems, and there's disproportionate criminality. There's exploitation of state services, of the welfare state. And I should say, I'm not just talking about, I'm looking in-house as well. I'm talking about the Hasidic community, the Haredi community in the UK as well, which is also, I consider for these purposes, also an immigrant community. And see, okay, they don't do violent crime, so they're actually a very peaceful community. But when it comes to interacting with the state and state benefits and welfare, there's very systematic exploitation of these systems, which, when done on a large scale, kind of follows out the state, makes the country poorer per capita, and creates a sense of unfairness in the rest of the population. That the people coming here, exploiting our goodwill, exploiting our hospitality, and not abiding by our expectations and our values and rules.
Interesting. So what is your own feeling vis-a-vis both the Hasidic community you come from and other immigrant populations when they settle in Europe or in the UK about how they have to integrate? Do you have a strong feeling about assimilation?
I wouldn't use the word assimilation. I'd use the word integration. I think people who come to a country need to understand that they are guests coming to a host country, which means, it's like if I take a guest into my home, you follow the rules of my home. So you follow the rules of the country, you appreciate it towards the country, you help build the country, you try the best as you can to contribute to the country, and you make a good citizen. And I have to say, most Jews who came to this country in the last century and a half have done just that. Most Jews, especially in my current community, which is the wider Jewish community, are very law-abiding and are horrified by ideas of benefit fraud and tax evasion. And I think it's a very strong ethos in the wider Jewish community of kind of, well, we know as Dina de Machisa Dina, the law of the land is the land, it is the law, and you have to integrate and contribute to the country. The problem is that hasn't been the case recently, and very, very large numbers of people have come, many of which have not contributed positively to the country and have not made any effort to integrate, which creates a feeling that the country is losing its identity, it's becoming more fractured, there's parallel societies forming, in which extremism can foster, and so on. And I'd say primarily it's a failing of immigration policy, in my opinion. The government should not have let in so many people at such a fast rate, at a rate where they can't integrate. Because they don't, there's so many coming that they just end up living amongst themselves. So they never get to see a different Britain. That's failing number one. And failing number two is we're very laissez-faire here. We're very liberal on matters of integration and multiculturalism. They have an idea that everyone should just live their own way according to their own values. And we don't demand of communities to integrate and become part of the fabric of this country. And again, the consensus is changing now. People across the political spectrum, people are talking much more, are being much more tough about this. But I think it's far too late. And there's long-term consequences for the policies of the last decade or so.
Interesting. You could see benefits to that laissez-faire attitude towards minorities retaining their distinct identities, in that it allows a society to have a plurality of different cultures and a richness to it, is my view. What do you think about that? There's kind of a loss of cultural richness if there's too much push for integration, language learning, and all of this adaptations.
I'd say two things. Firstly, again, I'm not talking about assimilation. I'm not talking about people, I'm a proud British Jew. I didn't become a British Christian to assimilate. I'm a Jew. I have my own Jewish ways and my Jewish festivals, my Jewish learning, Jewish schools. But by integration, I mean that we respect the law of the land. We try to fit in with the values of the land. We try to, know our non-Jewish neighbors and have good relationships with them. and participate in the fabric of this country. That's one thing. So you can still have all that cultural richness. Second thing is, I think in the American context, for some reason, and I'm not sure the exact reason. For example, when you have Muslim immigrant communities in America, they tend to be much more moderate and willing to integrate and of more cultural compatibility. In Europe, there's a specific case of large, very extremist Muslim communities, which are a national threat to the country. We've had across Europe many terror attacks coming from within. So that's an active threat to the country. So I think if multiculturalism turns into a threat, then it negates the benefits. And thirdly, I'd make a wider point, and I don't want to dwell on it too much because it's theoretical, but I'm not sure. I'm struggling. I think we should learn from history. I'm not sure I know of a good example from history of a society that was truly multicultural, where different communities kept different languages, different law systems, different values, and it ended up peacefully. I think if we look at history teaches us that humans work best when they're in systems of governance that are quite homogenous. It doesn't mean racially homogenous. It means that everyone buys into the same values and laws. I think truly multicultural societies often end in conflict, in bloodshed. I think we see this. If you look in the Balkans, for example, or in any other country, in African countries where there's lots of ethnicities kind of vying for power, I think that's what you see happening. And I'd argue that in America too, you have your own issues stemming from multiculturalism, with occasional riots and violence and so on. Although I think the American context is very different to the British context and the European context as a whole, because America was made multicultural by the dominant power who brought over Africans as slaves, for example. So, Africans were made part of the American fabric against their own will. So they're automatically part of the American fabric. America was founded as that kind of society. What's unique about Europe, and especially Britain, is that until a decade ago, Britain has been a homogenous society for 1,000 years. One of the statistics I find very mind-boggling is that in the last few years, more people came to Britain than has come in the 1,000 years beforehand combined, right? So we're talking about a country that has gone through its whole evolution and cultural development very homogeneously, very continuously. We've developed our concepts of democracy, which we've shared with the world. Magna Carta, parliamentary democracy is a British invention. We've evolved. When I say we, I mean I'm not ethnically British. I'm also from an immigrant background. But as a country, the country has evolved in a particular fashion for a long time. And to have a very, very sudden disruption and very radical demographic change in record time, we just can't catch up. So that causes a lot of upheaval and disruption and pressure on cultural cohesion. Again, America has always been a country of immigrants. You've had that baked in, the idea of the melting pot, those narratives. Britain and Europe hasn't. So you can't create that overnight by bringing millions in a given year. It has a different impact.
What would you say is the prevalent Jewish community's attitude towards the Muslim immigrants in general? Because I think here in the US, there's a lot of effort. I'm not talking about the Orthodox community, I'm talking about the Jewish community writ large to be inclusive.
Yeah, it's very similar here. I think because the Jewish community also has an immigrant background, and because Jews are an ethnic minority, there is solidarity with other people from ethnic minority backgrounds, from immigrant backgrounds. And the Jewish community tends to be disproportionately educated and liberal, which causes the predictable attitudes towards these issues. I'd say that if you talk with people on the ground, attitudes are changing very, very rapidly, meaning that if you just talk with random Jews, they'll tell you, mass migration has made us less safe as Jews in this country. It hasn't been reflected yet in the spokespeople and in the institutions. The institutions haven't said that yet, and maybe they're right not to for political reasons. But I would say the Jewish community does need to reckon a bit more with the fact that immigration policies that maybe it has supported have been a disaster, not only for the country, but specifically for the Jewish community. And especially now, as I would call to my fellow British Jews, especially now as the mood in the country is changing, and there's increasingly support for severely restricting immigration and even reversing, harm minimization. When it comes to this, I think the Jewish community should join this feeling and trend and understand that it has not been in its favor, mass immigration.
A lot of food for thought. I want to turn the conversation to you personally for a minute. I know your journey from the Hasidic community. We've talked about that a little bit. I'm interested if you can share your political journey from your days as a Hasidic child or Hasidic young man up to today, how you have evolved personally over the years.
When I was Hasidic, I didn't really have a political consciousness. I think nowadays Hasidim, especially Hasidim in America, tend to be politically involved. There was a great Trump fever, which to some extent reflected in the Hasidic community in this country. And ironically, I think Hasidim in the UK are more clued up on American politics than they are on British politics, because it's more interesting and more blitzy, and the Yiddish newspapers write about it. When I left the community, I was naturally drawn to kind of liberal left arguments. As when you leave a patriarchal, quite conservative community, you are. In university, I was quite disillusioned. I had to fight for free speech, and there was then the big kind of trans orthodoxy, where you really had to toe the line, or you were called all kinds of names. And I found,
Has that changed? Has that orthodoxy lessened?
I don't know if it's just me leaving university, so no longer being in that environment. But I do think we've passed the peak, meaning we've had several government policies now that have reversed some of these things. Politically now, trans orthodoxy is on the back foot. I think at least it's more acceptable to challenge it. You don't have to. When I was at university, you had to agree full-heartedly with it. You couldn't voice the slightest doubt, which is something that triggered me, coming from a society where you're not allowed to voice doubt.
I remember that you struggled with, is it okay to talk about it? That you struggled with, like, you realized you're not allowed to talk about a certain subject, like even ask questions. And that was something that you really struggled with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that was part of me kind of being a bit disillusioned with that kind of politics. But also, I think by nature, I'm lowercase conservative. I believe in institutions. I believe in rule of law. I believe in tradition. It may seem ironic given that I left the community, but maybe we can talk about it. I do believe in tradition. I believe in continuity. And Britain is a country that, unlike the French, we haven't had radical revolutions. We have been a country that has changed through continuous and gradual evolution. And it's been very good for us as a country. We're not backwards behind because we're stuck by tradition, but we are more consensual. We're less divided. Until recently, I should say. Again, I think recent events have been very polarizing in this country. The country is going in more of an American direction, and it's not unrelated to mass migration as well. But until very recently, the country is a country of consensus. In Britain, there's an iron law that you don't win unless you only win from the center. It's a country where people like to have common ways of looking at things. And so I think in my heart, I kind of see the value of that. So I don't like any kind of politics that's radical, wants to be revolutionary, or radically redefine words that we use. Yeah, or question, overthrow our past and say our whole past was bad. I'm not on board with that.
I find, in my experience, a very stark distinction between us here in the United States and the UK is we don't have such a strong workers' history, and there isn't that sense of unity with the worker, meaning the everyday people. America feels much less united in that sense. So I do appreciate what you are saying when you speak to a kind of a center and a cohesion, which I have sensed in communicating with people in the UK versus and reading content from the UK versus here in the US. That's definitely a distinction I have experienced.
Look, our institutions here are less corrupt than in America, meaning in the UK, you can expect, again, until very recently, I think things are changing, you can expect the civil service, in theory, to be neutral, the judges to be neutral, the institutions interact with to be politically neutral. You don't find the kind of politics that says tear it all down. You don't have this in the UK. Someone like Trump would not have a fighting chance in the UK. And I think that's a sign of a healthier society, that not everything is politicized. We have consensus on certain things.
Yeah. I've seen in your own work, I have seen this very strongly, how much you have a belief in the government, in the rule of law, in enforcing standards. For instance, the issue of Hasidic education is a good example where my interest has often been understanding what motivates Hasidim to do their own thing with regards to education. And your view has more been, what is the government supposed to do here? What is the right thing? And what can the government do about the right thing, which comes from top down in a belief in institutions that I think I don't see as coming from our background. We come from a background where it's like, don't be a grude mechel, don't be such a straight, don't stand in that British queue, don't be so straight and square.
But these things are related to each other. It's the ecosystem. So in the UK, what's the consequence of a community that doesn't educate its children? The consequence is that I, the taxpayer, am going to have to subsidize them through a very generous welfare state, right? So the community can't say it's not the government's business whether we get educated or not, because it literally is. The government is going to have to cover your deficit. The government is going to put bread on your table, right? So, Hasidim often say, well, we're libertarians. The government shouldn't get involved. But when it comes to getting money, they're very happy to not be libertarians, right? So in a country where the government looks after you, it is the government's responsibility to make sure that you can look after yourself. It goes together.
If there was no welfare state,
that would be very different. But then we wouldn't be the country that we are. The idea of a welfare state and common responsibility is very deep within this country, but it goes back to having a common identity and an identity of solidarity, which ties into a history of homogeneity. We're a bit closer to a family than Americans are. We go back. There's a history. There's a community. There's a people that look after the weak and expect everyone to abide by the laws. It's more integrated, and that is disintegrating at the moment, in large part due to mass immigration, which I think is causing lots of upheaval. It's a moment of the equilibrium is being destroyed, and we may reach a new American equilibrium, and we may look a bit more like America, but there'll be a period of violence and of uncertainty to get there.
It's very interesting. I think I have a personal philosophy that too much bureaucracy, rule following stifles innovation. And I think that's a part of what motivates my sympathy. I wouldn't say my endorsement, but my sympathy for a more hands-off government approach, meaning, yes, the government should provide services. And yes, it's built into the assumption that when the government provides services, there will be some degree of abuse. My feeling is the focus on dealing with corruption should be on high level of corruption, not a little person getting a little more in benefits than they are entitled to. To me, that is like picking, like, how do you say it? Shooting down. when you pick on this, punching down. Oh my God, I'm really not on my game today. It's punching down. So it's my feeling that when I often see people be frustrated with someone who gets welfare, for instance, in the United States, welfare is negligible, while meanwhile there are giant contracts being handed out to cronies of politicians. I have a hard time feeling indignant at someone getting a little bit more welfare money. Because I feel like we should be focusing on the big structural problems that allow for parties to receive large sums and thereby exploiting these collective coffers we all contribute to. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it is I have an attitude which I see coming from my Hasidic background of appreciating a little bit of like a looseness towards rules as an opportunity for innovation. Like so much rigidity, so much yekishness, so much like this, like the rules and following the rules creates a very narrow container from which you cannot have creative innovation, which I think is very healthy for a society.
I think for me, talking politically, this is an entirely theoretical discussion because we are we are very different countries in the way we run. Meaning, welfare is not negligible here; it's incredibly generous. Meaning, somebody can be earning quite significantly more money than me, and yet my tax money is subsidizing his income, right? So I am paying tax to subsidize his income simply because he did some dodgy stuff in his claims. So it's very generous here. The
Is it
state
the
is,
universal credit
yes,
system?
yes, but there's all kinds of ways you can get money here, and it's being exploited. Yeah, so I think this is a bit theoretical what you're saying, because when I'm saying it's a scandal that it's so easy to exploit the welfare state, I'm not making an argument whether there should be a welfare state or not. I'm saying there is a welfare state. It's very generous, and people should not be abusing it on the taxpayers' accounts when our taxes keep going out every year. I'm not making a theoretical argument, is what I'm saying.
I see, I see, I see. It's a very literal argument that I am paying for what is literally going to. I hear you. What is your thinking about rigidity stifling innovation? I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on it.
I think this country Britain has a great history of innovation. We've invented the scientific revolution, we've invented the industrial revolution. Probably government was smaller then, not probably, it definitely was. And you may be right, rigidity is stifling innovation. We know that Europe has lost the edge against America a long time ago. But it's not just rigidity. I think that's part of it, but it's also the high taxes we pay. It's just not worth it here. People, every year, thousands of millionaires are leaving this country to go to America to set up businesses. It's not worth it here. So our taxes are way too high. We punish success here. We punish innovation.
I don't even know if innovation is now headquartered in the US anymore. I think it's gone to Asia. I don't know. We've also stifled a lot of innovation here.
I think per capita, America is still way, way ahead. Even in absolute terms, it's way ahead. Even though you have around 200 million people, and China has close to 1 billion. I think America still has the edge. So no, I think America is way ahead of the curve still.
So, here in the US, I'm not going to say in the US, I'm going to say on my comments online, I see a lot of sentiments on anti-Semitism, a lot, which is a part of what I see is like the Jews always feel sorry for themselves, and they're committing this genocide in Israel. That's like the standard comment I keep getting. And how about they have some empathy for others? To what degree do you experience that as like your lived experience in the UK? For me, as a Jew, that's been my experience as a content creator online. This is the attitude towards anti-Semitism, and it shuts down any ability to have a conversation about real concerns around anti-Semitism. To what degree is that something you're dealing with in the UK?
Yeah, it's very similar. It's very similar. People are very enraged by what's happening in the Middle East, and they see Jews, because Jews tend to be supportive of Israel, and they see Jews as being either complicit or not doing enough to stop it. And I'm open to these kinds of critiques. I've been personally very disturbed about some elements of Israeli government policy in Gaza. I'm not a geopolitical expert. I don't live in Israel, so I don't have stakes in it. So I'm not going to give my opinions on what they should have done better. But I do think I'm not convinced by the argument that Israel has done enough to protect Palestinian civilians. I do think there's disturbing attitudes within the Israeli population towards Palestinians. I do think that the current Israeli government has, worked very hard to destroy a two-state solution, which ultimately, I don't think you can keep a population perpetually under oppression and occupation. So I'm sympathetic towards these arguments. I still don't think I have to accept, as a British Jew, my life should be less safe here because of it. I don't have to accept it. I don't think anyone needs to accept that. I think people should protest Israel. People should decry whatever injustices they see happening there, and I think British Jews should still be able to feel safe in this country, which is currently not as it should be.
Do you feel like you opted out to some degree of anti-Semitism? And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. I have had various conversations with my family where I was surprised to hear them describe their experience as visibly Jewish people as being very cognizant. Like the story I had mentioned with my brother, he told me yesterday, he started a story like this, that he woke in the middle of the night while sleeping next to my mother in the hospital, screaming because he had a bad dream, and the nurse came running in. So he says then, I think I had the bad dream because while I was walking to the hospital, someone screamed after me, "You Jews take all our money." And I thought to myself, that never happens to me. No one screams that at me. And that's because I feel like to some degree, I opted out of anti-Semitism by becoming ex-Hasidic. I no longer look visibly Hasidic. And so like I'm talking to my father and I'm telling him how amazing the trains are. And he then says, well, for you, for me, it's not. And I'm like, oh, right. So I'm wondering, do you feel like that has happened for you? What's going on with people who are visibly Jewish versus those that maybe are not so visibly Jewish?
Yeah, so firstly, I mean, I haven't completely opted out, so I can also sometimes be spotted. But, yeah, I'm not always comfortable walking around with my kippah in certain places. And I know a lot of Jews make these calculations of when to take them off and when to put them back on. And you're absolutely right. Speaking with my visibly Jewish friends, this is something that they expect. It's an everyday occurrence. When they leave their neighborhoods, go somewhere in central London, they are going to face abuse. Ironically, Hasidic Jews are the least Zionist of all the Jews, right? So, and that doesn't help them. I think a few things to say. Firstly, Hasidic Jews, it's very bad, but they're also self-isolated as well, insular, meaning they're usually not part of universities. They don't work in regular institutions, right? So I think for a lot of Hasidic Jews, okay, when you leave the neighborhood, you're in defensive mode, you may suffer, and then you go back home and you're safe, right? And to some extent, the way I was brought up as a Hasidic Jew, we grew up with a thing, I'm sure you recognize it, which means it's an iron law of nature that non-Jews hate Jews.
Jews are hated, yeah.
Jews are hated, and we're expecting it. And we, I think there's almost there's a quote, I don't remember who said it, that kind of a God who doesn't hate Jews is almost like he's not fulfilling his duty, right? That's kind of an attitude that we've brought up. So anti-Semitism is brought by God for certain reasons. That I think it's quite different when you are a more secular Jew or Jew in wider society. You're right, you may not face it all the time if you're not visibly Jewish. On the other hand, you're a student at university, you're at work, and in the air, you'll feel anti-Semitism, you'll be excluded. When people find out you're Jewish, you'll face prejudice. And there's a kind of anti-Semitism which is not even anti-Semitism that comes from hating Jews per se, but from excluding them from recognizing that we are a minority that has been on the receiving end of persecution. And I'll give you an example that happened to me personally. I was applying for a scholarship with the Mathematics Institute a few years ago. And for the interview, they asked me to prepare to talk about a mathematician from a diverse set of backgrounds. So I decided to talk about Emmy Noether. She was a Jewish mathematician, female Jewish mathematician in 1930s Germany. And she couldn't teach under her own name and receive a salary because she was a woman. She had to teach under her supervisor's name, a man. So I thought that makes a diverse set of backgrounds. And secondly, she got fired from a position in the 1930s by the Nazis and had to escape to America, right? So I talked about her, and the interviewer told me, but she's white. She was white. She's not from a diverse set of backgrounds. I said, well, I don't think being in the 1930s Germany as a Jew I don't think it's relevant whether you're white or not, you were a Jew. And she said, yeah, but the purpose of talking about diverse people in mathematics is if you teach pupils of color, you want to inspire them, somebody who looks like them. And Emmy Noether looks white. She was German, and Germany is a white country. So I said, well, they'll know about the Holocaust, and they'll be inspired that somebody was able to do great mathematics under these conditions. And the interviewer said, what if they don't know about the Holocaust? How's that going to inspire them?
This cannot be real. Wow, that's
and this is insane. This is insane because it shows that Jews defy the clean line between oppressed and oppressor, right? Because in many places we're doing well, we're successful, but this binary, this very simplistic view of looking at things, means that the Jewish experience of persecution and of genocide has been erased. So this is kind of more, I think, pervasive, more subtle attitudes that a lot of Jews encounter in white society, which can be very frustrating. Kind of not recognition of our history and quite a lot of ignorance about who we are.
Yeah, I raised my son in the wider world. He's now in college, and he grew up truly, I'm not trying to feel sorry for him or anything because he grew up with a lot of love, but he grew up very underprivileged. There were many, many years that I had no money and we went with nothing. There was a 9-month period I couldn't pay rent. He really, really had a very, very underprivileged childhood, which I see as being very related to the trauma that was passed down generationally. And he will often make comments to the effect of, oh, well, this application as a white male, I can't apply, and I'm like, I don't understand how you have placed yourself in this box. You are not a privileged white male to me. You are a Jewish kid who was raised virtually by one person in very difficult circumstances, had to get a job at a really young age and hold a lot up, and went with very little that other kids who are in the white privileged category did not experience. And yet that's become the criteria, which is defined by color of the skin, which seems so hypocritical for often people who say they don't see color of the skin. It also erases class, which is such an important definer of privilege, and also disability. What if someone is disabled and is white? It just is so depressing that we should reduce our efforts to create a more diverse concept of what people can be, which I endorse fully, to color of the skin.
I would take this argument even further. I would say even privileged white males are not privileged because, in fact, when it comes to applying to elite institutions in America, you are distinctly disadvantaged if you are a white male. If you are black or of another minority, your chances of getting in, equalized for merit, is much, much higher. This has been proven a lot, and there's a lot of controversy around it because it's illegal to do it, but it's still race discriminate. In fact, race discrimination has been reversed for quite a while now. In the UK, I think we're at a different stage. It's not as pervasive, I think. We don't have the same kind of history with race. But I think many institutions want to take it in that direction. And there's a fight now about it. But I think the idea that you would give people better options simply because of the skin color is the definition of racism. And it's not only is unjust, it also reduces standards. It also it makes institutions, it sends institutions to the lowest common denominator. It reduces excellence, and it's dangerous. I've heard a lecture recently about what's been happening in the medical profession in America, where DEI has trumped excellence, which means that lower quality doctors are getting hired. It's a big scandal.
I feel like I'm sympathetic to the idea of correcting for ways in which people of underprivileged backgrounds are going to test lower. and present worse than people of privileged backgrounds. So I feel like, in theory, the idea that there should be leeway for people with less privileged backgrounds to be given priority, despite not be given priority, to be able to compensate for lack of, let's say, advanced tutoring, for more cultural exposure, for more education. So there are these ways in which those of less privileged backgrounds, let's say black people, black and brown people, have historically had less access to advanced education opportunities, and to take that into account when they're applying for university, and to say, well, there might be more abilities that aren't as well expressed on these exams and in this application package, and to take that into account in admissions seems fair to me.
I think that theory has been thoroughly falsified, because I think if that was right, that all you're doing is fishing out the talent, then you'd expect when it came to graduation, the people you've taken in because of DEI policies would be doing roughly the same, because you found the talent who simply didn't have the good tutoring. That's not the case. The people who get taken in for DEI policies very, very disproportionately drop out or get very, very low grades, don't make a passing grade. Like, meaning you're not really improving their performance. All you're doing is giving them an artificial push ahead and lowering standards. You're not actually, I'm not saying in all cases, I'm saying statistically in the larger picture. So I don't think that theory is a nice theory. I don't think it is backed by careful data. And, usually when you do a policy, you'd expect you to follow it through and you'd collect the data and see how effective it is. And every time that's been done, these theories have shown that these policies don't work at all.
I hear. Well, I want to move on to, actually, you were pointing out your kippah earlier, and that was something I wanted to speak to, because I didn't know you're wearing a kippah. So can I ask about that?
Yeah.
Has anything changed in your religious life since we last spoke?
Yeah, I guess so. It's a concept. I've never been completely static. I've always been evolving more or less. I think what's happened recently, especially since my mother's passing, but even beforehand, I've been there's a few issues at stake. Firstly, I've been trying very hard, as you know, to become closer to my family over many, many years, and part of that has been in certain ways to come part of the way. I'm not Hasidic, but to come part of the way and be part of a Jewish religious community. Part of it is I'm getting married in 2 months.
Congratulations, Mazel Tov.
Thank you. And with my partner, we've kind of had lots of discussions and about how we want our future family life to look. And I think we're happy to belong to a religious community. I won't go into all the personal details that are between me and my maker, as you may say. But we're part of a more religious community, as well as being solidly part of the world. I'm a man of science. I'm a man of the world that believes that you are Jewish not by running away from the world, but by being in the world and engaging with the world.
At your core, you're still Izzy. You're the same person. I didn't expect that to have changed. It's interesting because I interviewed not too long ago Naftali Moster, who was the very, very visible face of the U.S. education issue and who was not from, and he has joined a modern Orthodox community in part because he is, I think, also more on the conservative side of things, but also because he wanted to raise his children in that kind of environment. He felt the family life suited him better. And it was my understanding, I hope I'm not misquoting or phrasing incorrectly where he stood, but I asked him if God plays a role in his life. And my understanding was he was modern orthoprax, meaning it wasn't faith motivated, but it was seeking community. It wasn't necessarily that he believed God wants you to observe the Shabbos, but that the Shabbos was something he found rejuvenating in a more like practical way. Do you mind if I ask if you've had like a spiritual transformation since we last spoke?
I believe in the Jewish people. I believe in the Jewish community. I believe in, as I said, I'm an OSC conservative. I believe in tradition. I think as Jews, we have a tremendous heritage that we have created as a people, going back to the Tanakh, all the way through to, I don't know who you want to name. What's he called? You can think of any big cultural figure or figure in philosophy or physics. We're still creating, and we're still creating our
Einstein.
Einstein. I was thinking of Woody Allen was the name I had in mind, but that's really
Got
cool.
it.
And for me, I was brought up on the lap of that heritage, albeit from a very narrow perspective, but I still carry a great love to Jewish learning. And I've had the privilege of, since leaving my community, to have wider horizons to explore it, different perspectives, newer perspectives rooted in what's being called Chochmas Yisrael, Wissenschafts des Judentum, or academic Jewish studies, which have shed very new light on how Judaism has evolved and continues to develop. And I find it meaningful to be part of that evolving tradition that grapples with the texts. What does it mean? How much of it, what bits are still relevant to us? What bits do we make relevant to us? The festivals, and I'll admit there's some things in Judaism which I find utterly irrelevant. Not saying I'm not doing them, but I find, there's things, you mentioned Shabbat. I really, really connect to Shabbos. Kashrut, which is equally important in Judaism, I don't connect to at all. Doesn't mean I don't do it, but it's not something that I'm drawn to. But we're now in Sukkot. It's a festival that was always my favorite festival, and I love it. It's so earthy. It's so down to earth. It's so it's tactile. It's olfactory. And if you look in the verses, in the original verses in Tanakh, it's all about it's the end of the harvest season, and you just take your vegetation and you dance with it. Listen, and that's what shaping the lulav is. I don't believe in when supernatural and metaphysical things of influencing the weather. It's simply you're happy with being part of nature, and it's really immersive. As you might say, the sticker is very immersive.
I share those sentiments. I think I feel similarly. You know what? I just remembered. I'm going to make you eat your words. You told me like 2 years ago, maybe, that you're going to wear a shtreimel to your wedding. You weren't even dating, I think, at the time. Is that happening?
I have to tell you, it's yes and no, meaning I don't want to go into too many private matters, but it has to do a lot with my relationship with my Hasidic family. When things are good, I feel, yes, I want to do it. When things are bad, I feel like I can't do it. But yes, in theory, yes.
I see. In theory, yes. Would it go with the Bekisha?
Yes. And my Kala really wants me to do it. Yeah, but Bekisha, yeah.
Can I ask at all about how things are with your family? Only what you're comfortable sharing.
It's complicated. I think things have gotten better since my mother's passing, and I think a lot of work has gone into it. And a lot of work, my mother has prepared the work just before she passed. She's prepared a lot of the work.
Meaning she was trying to bring you back. Just to catch people up, you were estranged for 7 years, and then you were starting 8 years, and she was starting to bring you back into the family by spending time with you. And then she passed away in the car accident in France.
Yeah, not just by spending time with me. She was actively planning. She was planning the event somehow. She was starting to talk with my siblings about me, and then she passed away. And things have gotten better family-wise since then. I wrote a poem, in fact, about how my mother's death forced the family together. Maybe I can send you the poem and you can put it up. The poem is essentially how the family reunion could have been with my mother earlier, and instead the family reunion was at a funeral, because that's when I met my siblings for the first time in 8 years at a coffin. And in fact, my youngest sister didn't even know I existed until that day. On the day of my mother's funeral, she was 8. She found out that she had another brother. So since then, there's been more contact. I'm not going to pretend it's easy. It's not easy, and it's something that caused a lot of frustration, I'm sure, on both sides, and it's something we have to fight for. But I believe in family. I really believe in family. I believe that family is not only when it comes easy. Family is also when it's difficult.
I think, you know, I'm just gonna like unsolicited advice is what people definitely hate. So I'm gonna do that. I feel like you're very lucky to have gone through all of this traumatic sort of working through before you started to have children, because I think it's really good for children to grow up with a network of large number of family members and support if possible. And I think it's good that you're working through it. No, that's just my feeling, having raised a child alone.
No, I'm not so sure. I don't know how, how that relationship's going to work out, because my child is going to be brought up in a very different worldview than their cousins. And my family, I don't know how your family is, but my family is incredibly close. And every little thing is very threatening to them. So just hearing a small word of what they would regard as not in line with their worldview is a whole thing. And, I'm an adult. I can try and censor myself and, and say the right things. But if you have a 5-year-old, they can't, they'll say things. And so then how a family will take to
Yeah.
that. I don't know if my brothers will let their children play with my children. I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to make it. I hope they'll have cousins and family, but I just can't make that assumption.
I get it, because I also took my son to my family, and my son's father is Hasidic, and his father always maintained a relationship with him. But the cultural chasm was always such that there was not really an opportunity for closeness because of that, because there's that messaging or the fear from them. So there's maybe not that kind of organic family relationship you have when you're not afraid that the child will say something. It's definitely an issue that I relate to. Well, scratch all my advice. I didn't say anything. I didn't give any
No,
advice.
I mean, unlike some people who have no experience and give unsolicited advice, you're very experienced in this.
Yeah. When I see people have families, large extended families, I think that's a great blessing. Especially my son's an only child, but in general, when I see someone is able to raise children across different cultures, I think that's very enriching to the child and a great gift to the child. If possible, it's not always possible. We try our best, but sometimes we're just dealing with a hand we're dealt, and we do as well as we can.
Look, the way I feel now, I'd love for my child to be able to imbibe some of that more, maybe you can use the word authentic, but some of that more pure, uh, pre-modern kind of spirit of Yiddishkeit that they may be missing in the Yiddishkeit I'll be bringing them up in. I'd love if they can imbibe some of that, but that doesn't depend only on me, if they'll be allowed to.
Yeah.
Because it's equally important for me that they're a person of the world and that they know science and they know there's a big world out there which doesn't end at the arrow's line. It's equally important to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we will have to pick this up again when you have a 5-year-old and talk about it then. I promise not to give advice. I'm just going to hear you out. Anything else you think we should have talked about that
Yeah,
we
I know
didn't?
you sent in the kind of questions you sent me in advance, you said we were going to talk about Zionism. We didn't get to talk much about it. I don't know if you want to pick it up.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's hear a little bit what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, as you know, and similar to you, I grew up in a very anti-Zionist community in Satmar. I think, yeah, you also grew up in Satmar. And I'd also be curious to hear your thoughts on Zionism. I've heard your interviews you've done with Peril and others about it. And for me, I definitely am a Zionist. And again, part of the way I view Yiddishkeit and the Jewish people is it's beyond very, the reasons we were anti-Zionist growing up was mainly because Yiddishkeit means a specific interpretation of orthodoxy, right? That's Yiddishkeit, and Yiddishkeit can't be anything else. And for me, Yiddishkeit is everything. Yiddishkeit is the culture and civilization the Jewish people have created, the literature they've created. And as for me, Yiddishkeit includes the creations of the Haskalah, the Haskalah. Yiddishkeit includes Yiddishist literature, which I didn't grow up in, despite being a native Yiddish speaker. And Yiddishkeit also includes Zionism. In fact, Zionism is is the most significant project of the Jewish people, perhaps ever, certainly in modern times. So for me, you can't exclude that from Judaism and from Yiddishkeit. It's an integral part of what it means to be Jewish, is to know that there is an Israel and there is a Jewish state, and you can have different feelings about any given government, and you don't have to agree with it, but you can't cut it out of what it means to be a Jew and what Yiddishkeit means.
Very interesting. How do you respond to the prevalent argument that Zionism is a colonialist project and has displaced the indigenous population, and therefore it needs to be dismantled?
Well, definitely disagree with it needs to be dismantled. But the problem of the fact that there's Palestinians in the land who they claim to land, this isn't new, and the thought leaders of Zionism in the early 20th century were very aware of it, and they wrote about it. They're unwarned that it's premature to found the Jewish state. And in fact, Zionism isn't synonymous with the Jewish state, really, until I don't remember the exact history, but until quite late in the 20th century, probably until the late 30s. Zionists, even at the World Zionist Congress, they didn't mention Jewish state. They mentioned Jewish homeland, and there was even I'm not so familiar with the history, but there's a big controversy when they tried to push a motion saying that they are going to call for Jewish state, and some people resigned. I think Chaim Weizmann resigned. But the point is, Zionism called for Jewish homeland in the land, and I think I'm very sympathetic to the arguments of Palestinians and to the suffering they've had, and I do think there's been displacement and ethnic cleansing during the 1948 wars, and I do think there's now certainly colonialism going on in the West Bank, and I think there's things similar to apartheid systems. I know people are very scared of the word, but I think a lot of elements of what's happening on the ground in the West Bank follows that, and I think but as much as you can be sympathetic to the Palestinian plight, Jews undeniably also have a connection to the land. Jews have for 2,000 years been mentioning a return to the land 3 times in their prayers, mentioning it. Every Jewish home traditionally leaves a wall empty of paint to show that the house is not finished until Jerusalem isn't rebuilt. On our happiest day of our lives, under the chuppah, we break the glass to remember Jerusalem. And for me, Zionism is just the modern manifestation of this age-old Jewish yearning to return to the land. So I think there are 2 peoples in the land, and they need to get along. And I don't think one should displace the other. And there should be some kind of, I'm not getting into politics because I have no idea, and I don't think anyone has an idea at this point. But there should be some kind of peaceful settlement. I think both Palestinians and Jews belong in the land. But as a Jew, I support that Jewish settlement in the land, and that makes me a Zionist.
I hear you. I appreciate you sharing. That was very interesting. I actually found your angle of seeing Zionism as part of the Jewish canon, essentially, of the Jewish culture, the identity of Judaism, to be very interesting. I've never heard it that way.
It absolutely is. Because if you think about it, for 2,000 years, Jews have been waiting for the Messiah. And how do you wait for the Messiah in modern times? You settle the land and you create the land, and that's the modern manifestation of the Messiah. It may not be the Messiah that comes down with a white horse and with the rings of fire, but that is a very medieval view of the Messiah. And the concept of the Messiah changes as people's metaphysics and theology changes. So I think Zionism absolutely is the continuation of the age-old messianism and the longing for Zion.
I definitely share, I think, on religious matters, a lot of your outlook of a more scientific-based connection to Judaism. And I think my own love for Israel, for instance, when I go to Israel, and a feeling of being somewhere special comes from that collective inheritance that goes not just from what I learned directly in my mother's lap, in my school, in my world, but we have absorbed for so many generations that it's practically in our bones, in our DNA. It's an intangible presence that makes us feel such a deep connection to Israel. And I think when people react, like turn Israel into such a matter of equating it with expeditions to colonize spaces by host countries, it's so inconceivable to me that someone should use the language of colonialism to such a different set of conditions that is Jews and Israel. And I think if you feel it in your bones, if you have that Jewish identity, if you have that Jewish inheritance, you can't even see the parallel, or that's the case for me anyway.
I mean, the colonialism thing. I mean, which colonial power has their ruins as the bottom layer of the ruins of the indigenous population? How, the Palestinian ruins and archaeological findings are much higher strata in the archaeological records than the Jewish ones. So who is indigenous exactly? Who is I think it's more complicated than that.
Yeah. I hear you. I really appreciate everything you shared today. This was really, really interesting. I have really enjoyed talking to you. I feel like I learned some things, and you really enlightened me on what's going on in the UK, which I hope to visit sometime not too far in the future. In the meantime, we got to give you a big mazel tov on your impending nuptials. I guess you're dusting off your shtreimel soon, which is very, very exciting, or whatever you're wearing. I'm sure it's going to be a lovely day, and I'm really excited for you.
Thank you very much.
So big mazel tov. Yeah. So thank you, Izzy.
If you want to fly over to the wedding, here you have an invitation.
Okay.
No pressure.
Okay. I appreciate it. Hasidic invitations, there's no pressure. Is there really? Or is there?
I don't know.
You come or you don't come. It's not like you've RSVP'd and now you have to show up for the Hindu and the this and the that, whatever they have in secular weddings that is before and after. Are you going to do a bachelor party? Secular stuff?
No, it's an off-brief.
An off-brief, okay. An off-brief. Okay. Very nice. Well, mazel tov. I really look forward to hearing a report, seeing pictures, I guess. Well, thank you, Izzy, so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you also to the viewers on YouTube and to the podcast listeners. I really appreciate it. I also want to say a thank you for my channel members who have been around for more than 2 years. I'm going to say thank you to Lisa Jones, Lena, Susan Solomon, Lauren Taylor, Joe Moore, and Max Hauer. A thank you to you in particular. And thank you, Izzy. Enjoy the rest of your day while the sun is still there a little bit. We can see it's gone. It's gone. It's over. Well, enjoy your evening, your Sukkot evening, your Chol Hamoed. I hope you have a nice holiday. Regards to your Kala.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.